For today's grim adventure, we find ourselves once again in London, where today we're going to spend the entire day tracking down the Jack the Ripper sites that you can actually visit. This is going to be fun. This is something we've been wanting to do for quite some time. Now, we chose to start this video off here in this alley because of this sign. It says Jack the Ripper. Who was Jack the Ripper? Now, there have been numerous attempts to uncover the identity of the man who brutally murdered 5 East End women between 31st of August and the 30th of November in 1888. Among those suspected were Queen Victoria's heir, the Duke of Clarence. The less prominent suspect was George Chapman, a barber surgeon who at the time lived in the cellar of this pub. Now, speaking of suspects for Jack the Ripper, it's been one of those debates that have been going on since 1888, whenever the murders took place here in Whitechapel. And I think it was sometime around 2014 where a DNA scientist got a hold of a bloody scarf that was owned by one of the victims, Catherine Eddowes. And they did some DNA testing on it, and it traced back to a guy by the name of Aaron Kosminski.
Good morning. The savagery of Jack the Ripper's crimes terrorized the residents of London. No one was even charged, although the police have had their suspicions. Now, more than a century later, modern technology may have finally unmasked the elusive killer. Few criminals have captivated the world's imagination like Jack the Ripper.
Altogether a different breed of killer.
This silk shawl is believed to be the last piece of physical evidence left from his killing spree more than 130 years ago. 2 biochemists who analyzed it say they detected the DNA of Catherine Eddowes, Jack the Ripper's 4th victim, in apparent bloodstains. They also found a semen stain they believe came from Aaron Kosminski, a 23-year-old Polish barber who at the time was a prime suspect.
Now, since we started coming to England, so many people have reached out to us and said, Grims, you need to take one of the Jack the Ripper tours. They are amazing. Well, here's the thing. Don't get me wrong. Tours are nice, but we like to get on the ground and explore these places ourselves. So that is what we are doing. Get ready for a Jack the Ripper tour and the likes you've never seen before.
It's coming my way, wherever I go, hard luck is there to stay. Good luck never stays a day, bad luck's always coming my way.
Now, before you head further down the road searching out the crime scene locations and lining up shots, another thing we wanted to show is this archway is a map of Whitechapel. It's really cool to look at. All right, baby goal, we have the entire day to do this. You ready? We got a lot of walking to do. Our first stop, our first official stop, is what is now known as the Tower Hamlets Town Hall. But back in the late 1800s, whenever the murders were happening, this was the Royal Hospital. And this building is very important because the famous From Hell letter was sent to a surgeon here. And with it was Catherine Eddowes' kidney. It was preserved in alcohol, I do believe. And this is one of the things that led people to believe that quite possibly the identity of Jack the Ripper was a surgeon. But at the same exact time, the letter was so crudely put together, like placed together with words that were completely misspelled. So it just added to the rumors. Now, if you remember, there was a movie that came out about Jack the Ripper called From Hell, starring Johnny Depp, and this is where they got the title for that. Now, here's the thing. Was the letter really written by Jack the Ripper, or was it not? It wasn't signed by Jack the Ripper, and around this time, there were a bunch of fakes, a bunch of different people claiming to be the Ripper were sending letters to all over the place. But this one is quite memorable, and for some reason, nobody knows. The letter itself, the actual letter, and the kidney have disappeared. But before that happened, a photo was taken of it.
From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir,
I send you half the kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
And the next location that we want to point out is actually almost directly across the street. And you can see that there's a lot of scrim happening, like they're doing some restoration work on some of the buildings, so there's this scrim, that's that white stuff you see. But oddly enough, how perfect is this? The one building that we want to show is the only one that we can see clearly. Now what makes this building very interesting is back at the time of the murders, this is where a lot of the inquests and the Ripper's murders actually took place. Like everything that we've learned about the Ripper murders came from here. Like the slashing of the throats and the disembowelments, it all came from people inside this building doing research and just trying to figure out who was Jack the Ripper. What I love about this is you can see all the restoration that's happening. I mean, that happens with time. But if you look right towards the top of the building, it says Working Lads Institute. That's original. That's back whenever the Ripper murders were happening. Crazy, right? Now, if I'm not mistaken, on paper, it says that there's 11 Jack the Ripper victims, but not all of them are for certain. When it comes down to it, there are 5 names on the list that are definite his. And basically what it comes down to is these 5 women, they had their throats cut as well as being disemboweled. The other ones, they weren't like that. So we're only going to visit the 5 most likely Jack the Ripper victims. Now, with that being said, the first site that we're going to visit is at the end of this street here. Today it's called Durwood Street, but back in 1888 it was known as Buck's Row. And it is here on August 31st, 1888, where the first victim, the first official victim, Mary Nichols, was found. Now when it comes to the murder of Mary Nichols, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because it's the first murder, or because the crime scene was so well photographed. I mean, the street, not the actual crime scene itself. I mean, there's a drawing that I'm going to show you. But from right about here, if I turn the camera down this way, there's a really nice historical photo taken from right about here looking down the street of the way the buildings used to look here. Now it's this, I'm guessing it's an apartment building of sorts. But this is it, Buck's Row. Before we show you the next photo, there's one thing I want to point out, and that's this giant building on the right-hand side of your screen. You see, back whenever Jack the Ripper was killing, this was the old schoolhouse in Whitechapel. And today, it's still standing. In fact, it's the only building on this street that still looks the same from back then. Now, here's the photo. And using this, we can pinpoint where the body of Mary Nichols was found. So we know that this apartment building on the left-hand side replaced those old buildings that used to be here. And we already know that the schoolhouse was here back whenever Jack the Ripper was killing. And looking at some other photos, we could tell that behind the schoolhouse was a schoolyard. Today, it is the Whitechapel station. And pretty much right where Jessica is standing right now is where Mary Nichols' body was found. And we know this because there's a photo and some drawings that show her laying at the base of a garage door. Like it was an entrance to a garage. And that used to be right here. Well, the approximate location. Now, there's another photo that was taken of this road from right about here. And in it, you can see the schoolyard behind the school building. And that's where that silver portion of the building, that's the Whitechapel station is. And just past that is where we were filming, and that's where Mary Nichols' body was found. So, let's see if I can line this up a little bit. That's just crazy. That's just crazy. Talk about walking back in time. This street is absolutely insane. It's a lot of non-stop traffic and people. I don't know how we're gonna be able to get the shots that we need, but that's okay because you kind of have to use your imagination. So this building that's across the street, this wasn't here back in 1888. It was actually, the buildings that were here were destroyed, and this building was rebuilt for the brewery. And 29 Hanbury Street used to stand right about the center of your screen. That's our best guesstimate. And you see those vertical concrete columns in between each store? If you look at those and you try to picture, again, using your imagination, you picture each individual housing sections in between those. It makes sense. You see what I mean? This old photo that we found, it matches up very similar. And then back to how it looks today. So what's special about 29 Hanbury Street here in London? Well, this is the site of Jack the Ripper's second victim. On September 8th, 1888, the body of Annie Chapman was found. Today, it's an art gallery. We decided to walk down the street to see if we can get behind the building, to see if there's anything still there, because actually on September 8th, 1888, when Annie Chapman was found, she was actually found in the backyard of where she was living at 29 Hanbury Street. And there are some pictures, not of the crime scene, but how it used to look. And she was found near the base of the stairs that went to the back door. Now, we got to stand corrected because we said it was an art gallery that is where Annie Chapman's body was found, but it's not. The White Gallery is actually a bridal gown store. And Jessica wants to go inside. Go for it. Now, Jessica's really sad. They won't let us in because, you see, they're having a private event. So this is the closest we're going to get, but everything's still beautiful. You get to see some beautiful women in bridal dresses.
That was a really big treat for me that they allowed us to show you what they were doing, because it wasn't that long ago that I wore a dress very similar to hers in a graveyard.
Tell you one thing, walking through the streets of London and these alleyways is actually quite surreal, knowing what happened here. I mean, if you're a fan of true crime in any way, shape, or form, and you know anything about Jack the Ripper, getting to do this, being able to walk these alleys, this is nuts. I never in a million years thought that I'd get to do this. And here we are. Again, you have to remember to look up. Since we decided to come back here and film, Jessica spotted this little plaque up here. So these two buildings that are here, I'm sure there's more of them, but it's a plaque that says these almshouses were erected in the year 1860. Now keep in mind, the Whitechapel murders happened in 1888. These were built for poor inhabitants. And most of the people that lived in Whitechapel and Spitalfield were poor. So these are still standing. Like, that just blows my mind. We now find ourselves on Enrique Street, which back in 1888, this was known as Burner Street. And this is where Jack the Ripper's third victim was found, Elizabeth Stride. And that was September 30th, 1888. Now, when it comes to the murder of Elizabeth Stride, there are actually two different things that we can point out here on Enrique Street. And This is the kind of stuff that I love. It's just like walking history, a dark history, but history nonetheless. Now this is really gonna blow your mind. Look at this old photograph. Right now, I am standing in almost the exact spot where this picture was taken. And this is how this street, this intersection used to look like back then. Now, look further down the street. You see that lamppost right there? I'm gonna go ahead and put a red arrow. There was an eyewitness that saw a woman making out, kissing if you will, with a man, right about where that lamppost is. Now, I'm gonna fade this out to how this place looks today. It's crazy. Look at that. My, how things have changed. Now this is important because it is believed that that woman making out with that guy was Elizabeth Stride hours before she was murdered. It's crazy to think at one point there were these 2-level housing units on both sides of this road. And this is how it looks today. I mean, there are apartments now, but right where the houses were, right where Elizabeth Stride was believed to have been kissing this guy, making out with him, if you will, it's now a nice little park area. Now, our best guesstimate, if you will, is that lamppost in that photo was right down here at the entrance to the grassy area. And back up and take it all in. Crazy, right? So this was just a mere couple hours before her body was found. So let's go to where they found her body. This old photo that you're looking at right now is the closest thing that we have to pinpoint where Elizabeth Stride's body was found, like visually. Now in it, you see this wagon wheel up there between the two buildings? Right below that is where she was found. Now, this blows my mind. This photo was taken somewhere like the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it clearly shows shops on this road. And today, those are all gone, and instead, it's a schoolyard. Now, looking at that photo, as far as we can tell, as close as we can tell, that wagon wheel, where it was, is where the gates or to the schoolyard are now, right? Like, how crazy is this?
I keep smiling because from what I can tell from the sounds of the kids playing at what I believe to be recess, I think they're playing a game of football. And it's nice to hear the sounds of laughter and fun where something so morbid once happened.
What I find crazy, what's crazy to me, is in preparation for this trip, I did so much research on where this was and where that was, and I walked these streets with Google Streets. And nothing compares to actually standing here, walking this history. Now I realize I keep calling the murders the Jack the Ripper murders, when in reality they were known as the Whitechapel murders, and the reason being Whitechapel really wasn't the greatest place to be. There was a lot of prostitution, robbery, fights, you name it. In fact, Whitechapel had what was considered the worst street in London. Our quest for Jack the Ripper now brings us to Mitre Square, where on September 30th, 1888, Catherine Eddowes, her body was found right around the corner from this wall. Now things have changed quite a bit and they keep changing, but we have a couple historic photos that we're gonna point out. But before we start lining up old photos, I wanted to show you this. It says the Holy Trinity Priory. It's a plaque that's in this ever-changing square, and I want to draw your attention down here to the bottom right-hand corner. It has a picture of Catherine Eddowes. In the early hours of September 30th, 1888, the body of Catherine Eddowes, victim of the notorious Whitechapel murders, more commonly known as Jack the Ripper, was discovered in Mitre Square, the square that we're in right now. When I say that the square is always changing, this is what I mean. You see about the center of your screen how the building looks older than the one on the left and the one on the right? So The officer who discovered Catherine Eddowes' body actually entered from this corner. It's a small little square, but here's a photo that shows what it used to look like. Now, it is believed that after Jack the Ripper killed Catherine Eddowes, he left the square over here in this corner. Now, of course, it didn't look like this. And here's a photo of how it once looked. Pretty wild, right? The ever-changing square. So that leaves us with trying to figure out where exactly the body of Catherine Eddowes was found. And from our best guess, it was right over here near this brick wall. Now, of course, none of this looked like this. There was actually a curve in the road as well as a curb here. And a lot of that has changed, but there is a photo that kind of matches up. Well, in a way, I mean, you have to use your imagination. So this is not exact, but our best guess puts the body of Catherine Eddowes right about where Jessica is standing right now. Now you have to remember that these 5 victims, they had their throats slashed, cut almost down to the bone. They were disemboweled, mutilated, decapitated, dismembered, strangled. I mean, it was a pretty gnarly sight. And I didn't talk about this earlier, but Mitre Corner at one point was actually also known as Ripper Corner. I mean, maybe to this day too. Now, trust us, if we wanted to, we could probably get really dirty and nitty gritty with all this. And I mean, you can always go online and read everything that you've ever wanted to know about the Ripper case. But one thing most people can't do is actually go and visit these places themselves. I mean, since we started doing this in this square, there's been 2 tours. So you can come here and take a Jack the Ripper tour. They're very popular. But also, you can just kind of go visit the places yourself. That's the magic, if you will. Because the square is constantly changing, here's how it looks today in 2024. I mean, so much has changed since 1888, that's for sure. And I'm sure it's going to happen again. Let me back up a little bit. Right? And oh yeah, one more thing. We can never remember what the name of this building is, but we are really close to the Egg Building. When it comes to the Whitechapel murders, the 2 neighborhoods where Jack the Ripper found his victims were Whitechapel and Spitalfield. And right now we're basically standing right in the heart of Spitalfield. The church on your right, that's the Christ Church. And then that dark building on the left-hand side, that is the 10 Bells Pub. It's been here since 1888. In fact, a lot of his victims were believed to have had a drink there. And it's also believed that Jack the Ripper, that's how he found his victims, by just kind of hanging around the bar in this intersection. Before we start talking about Jack the Ripper's final victim, Mary Kelly, I wanted to show you a little bit around the neighborhood here because a lot has changed since 1888. So right now we're almost directly behind Christ Church. That's the building on the left-hand side. The 10 Bells Pub is down at the end of this street on the corner on the right. And as I pan the camera over this way, you're gonna see how big these streets are today. But back in 1888, this was a very dark area. There was a lot of alleyways and a lot of like corridors, and we're gonna get into that in a little bit later on. But I just wanted to show this to you. I mean, a lot has definitely changed, but this whole area, this is considered, back in 1888, whenever Jack the Ripper and all these ladies were killed, to be the worst neighborhood in London. So much so, the worst street in London, Dorset Street, was found not too far from where we are standing right now. You always have to remember to look up. You see this sign on the side of the Christ Church? It says, "Commit no nuisances." When it comes to the worst street in London, Dorset Street, it is no longer here. Since 1888, it changed so much. And today they completely erased it and they put a building in its spot. And what's very interesting about this, the worst street in London was actually right next to this church, well, directly across the street. And even though it's no longer here, we're going to show you exactly where it once stood. And then we're going to talk about the death, the murder of Mary Kelly, which was probably the most gruesome out of all the Ripper victims. To be completely honest, I have no clue what year it was when they completely demolished Dorset Street and built a department store, if you will, in its place. But before they demolished it, it used to be an alleyway that led back to a parking lot. So it changed so much over the years that actually somebody photographed it looking up towards where Jessica is standing, where you see this giant monolith water fountain. So I'm going to point out a picture and you're going to see this at the end of the street. Now, what's really interesting about this, if I stand with my back to this monolith, which is actually a water fountain, and I look this way, this is the view that we get. It is a black bridge and a unique glow. Right there in the center of your screen, that is where the worst street in London, Dorset Street, used to stand. When it comes to the murder of Mary Kelly, it's the most brutal of them all. I mean, Jack the Ripper really mutilated her. And what I mean by that, most of the other girls, whenever he killed them, it was relatively quick. It's believed for Mary Kelly, he took over 2 hours. I mean, I'm not going to get too much into it, but basically everything that was on the inside was on the outside and all over the room. Mary Kelly lived on Dorset Street, the worst street here in London. And to be more specific, if you were to go all the way down to the end of Dorset Street, and we have a photo, there was an archway, and not a tunnel, but like a hallway, like an alleyway that led back to an even smaller section of this area. And that's where Mary Kelly lived. It was a one-room place with a door and a window. And at some point of her living there, this window broke. And instead of getting it fixed, what they did was they hung a piece of fabric over top of it. And if you can imagine, like whenever wind comes down an alleyway, it whips around. So I can just picture this cloth moving with the wind. Well, Mary Kelly had a reputation. And she liked to drink, she liked to party, and she really liked to sing. And she would come down here to the 10 Bells pub, which is like a stone's throw from where we are, and she would drink. And then she would grab her suitor, whoever it was that night, and go a block or two up to her one room with the fabric blowing in the window. Well, the night that she died, one of her neighbors heard her singing a song, and then it stopped, and everything was quiet. She didn't think anything of it, except for the fact that, wow, it's a little early for her to kind of just stop for the night. The next morning, the landlord came by. Mary Kelly was behind on her rent, and he went knocking on the door to collect. I mean, behind by like a couple weeks. And the door was locked. He was very persistent on getting his money, so he went over to this broken window and he moved that flap aside. And when he did this, what he saw chilled him to the bone. And he ran immediately, and he got the authorities, and they came, and this was, I'm not going to show it on here. YouTube will not like that. But there are some drawings, and if you know anything about Mary Kelly, if you saw the movie From Hell, which is actually based off of a graphic novel, Heather Graham plays Mary Kelly in that movie, loosely. It was brutal, it was nasty, and it's probably the most memorable. And for some reason, after her, it all stopped.
I remember when I saw a special about the Catherine Eddowes scarf, when they collected DNA from it, believing it could be the DNA of the killer. And it's still hearsay. You can choose to believe it or not. But the person's DNA that they got from it, I remember them saying something along the lines of when all these murders were occurring, they believed that he had a very bad case of syphilis. And if you know anything about that, it means the disease eventually, literally, eats your brain. And to them it made sense because as the killings got worse, the disease would have gotten worse. And they kind of attributed it to that. Whether that's true or not, it gave some interesting peeks into what was occurring back then.
We were sitting on the steps doing that little segment, and Jessica was enthralled with the scent of this tree that's in the courtyard next to the church. We're guessing it's honeysuckle. It smells beautiful. As for old photos of this area, we're gonna go ahead and stand over by the Christ Church of Spitalfields to try to line up some things, and in doing so, I noticed this. You see what this says? Look down here. Cafe in the Crypt. I don't know if you can read it from here, so I'm gonna go ahead and zoom in as much as I possibly can. That door in about the center of your screen, it says Crypt above it, so I'm guessing that's where the cafe is. I mean, there's tables out here. If it was open, you bet your bottom dollar we'd be in there grabbing a bite to eat. But nothing today. Now, before we leave this area, we have to go inside the 10 Bells pub. It's not nighttime, so it's not as spooky, but you can see all the beauty in the daylight. We had to poke our head in for a quick look at the 10 Bells pub before it opens for the day. They're kind enough to let us in here. Just look how beautiful this place is. Now, this is just the first floor. I can only imagine what this place is like at night. And there's the church. Spitalfields in modern times. Spitalfields in ye olden time, visiting a weaver's shop. Let's go ahead and walk around the bar the other side. Can you just imagine being here in London and doing a video on Jack the Ripper and standing inside the 10 Bells pub? This is beyond cool. Jessica's in love with the velvet couches, and here's why. It's like a man-made slide. The final stop on our Jack the Ripper tour brings us to St. Patrick's Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. And this is where you'll find the final resting place of Jack the Ripper's last victim, Mary Kelly. Honestly, we'd love to visit all the other ones, and at some point when we come back to England, I'm sure we will. But today, this is going to be the only one. This cemetery is actually pretty massive and very crowded. And thank goodness for findagrave.com, because typing in her name, you can kind of GPS directly to where you need to go. Now, just past Jessica, you can see those houses. Right next to the stone wall that's over there is what was known as the Common Graves back in 1888. And Mary Kelly's funeral, there was a procession, and I remember reading like thousands of people showed up for this. I mean, after all, it was a very, very brutal end. And a lot of people came out. And they buried her over here in the common area. Oh, baby, there's a horse coming. Did not expect that. So even though this area is not that big, it still is a rather small tombstone. But like I said, with the help of findagrave.com, I know I'm giving them a shout out. Mary Kelly's grave is right about there. All right, let's go pay our respects. So it looks like other people who've come here to pay their respects, they've left coins at our final resting place, so we're going to do the same. It's nice that they have this. Something that people can come and visit. So here is the marker of the final resting place for Mary Kelly. And I find it interesting that it says Marie Jeanette Kelly, but it says, in loving memory of Marie Jeanette Kelly, none but the lonely hearts can know my sadness. Love lives forever. Jessica asked a very good question, and that was, is she the only person that actually has a grave that you can visit? I'm not entirely sure. As far as I know, she is the only one that has a tombstone that somebody has left here. Everybody else, things have happened, things have passed, nobody really knows for sure, but you can go and visit like little markers saying that they are in this general area, like Mary Kelly. You know, it's been so long, this was kind of like a common grave area in the back of the cemetery, and nobody knows exactly where she's at. But this gives a spot for people to come and visit. And with that being said, thank you for joining us on another grim adventure, this time visiting some of the famous Jack the Ripper murder locations here in Whitechapel and Spitalfield, England. Well, London. Until next time, happy Halloween.
Wherever I come, bad luck is coming my way. Wherever I go, hard luck is there to stay. Good luck never stays a day. A bad luck's always coming my way.